Hello and welcome to the latest in our series of Watching Brief special news reports. This week has been a busy one for heritage crime stories. Just before Easter, the news broke that South Staffordshire Council had received an appeal against the enforcement notice they had issued on the 27th of February to the owners of the Crooked House pub in Himley. If you remember, the Crooked House was mysteriously burnt down in August 2023 and then unlawfully demolished a couple of days later. That unlawful demolition is what has led to the enforcement notice. But the owners, ATE Farms Limited, and in particular two named people, George Adam Taylor and Carly Taylor, plus an unnamed director, did have 30 days to appeal the enforcement, which would have required them to begin rebuilding the pub at their own cost. They have now lodged an appeal. It snuck in under the wire at the very last minute. And the council has now issued a further statement saying that we await the date for the appeal and the appointment of a planning inspector. There's no further information available at this time, and we will issue an update when we have more information. Now, the fact that it's gone to appeal is actually routine. It's to be expected. There are a number of previous cases where enforcement notices like the one issued against ATE Farms Limited have gone to appeal, and in fact the planning inspector has upheld the enforcement notice. So this doesn't mean that the Crooked House won't be rebuilt. It just means that there is another delay while the process follows through. We'll report on any updates as soon as we have them. Our second heritage crime story relates to the Watching Brief's old friends, the Hobby Lobby and Hobby Lobby Stores Inc. And its attempt to create a museum of the Bible. Now, they have been notoriously unlucky in their attempts to procure exhibits for the Museum of the Bible. From a standing start, they had no collection to build on like most museums, and so they went out into the international antiquities market to try and basically fill the Museum of the Bible, which I think was in Washington. Now, we reported at length on the Watching Brief about how they had to return artifacts to Iraq, which had been trafficked from Iraq after the Iraq War, after the Iraq invasion. But the latest story ends up with the Hobby Lobby back sort of in pocket, really, because an American judge has found in their favor in a case against a former Oxford academic called Dirk Obink. Dirk Obink was the librarian of the Egyptian Exploration Society and a member of a lecturer in papyrology in the Faculty of Classics in Oxford. He was the general editor of the famous Oxyrhynchus Papyri until August 2016. But in the course of those duties, he developed a commercial relationship with the Museum of the Bible, which is overseen by the Hobby Lobby, and sold them a whole series of papyrus fragments worth altogether around at least $6 million. Now, it turned out that the papyrus fragments had been stolen and sold illegally from the collections that Dr. Obink was in charge of. The Hobby Lobby sued him for fraud in the United States, and Judge David L. Russell has entered a motion for default, a default judgment in favor of the Hobby Lobby stores, awarding them just over $7 million, including prejudgment interest. Now, this is because Dirk Obink basically ignored the proceedings in the United States, didn't represent himself, was not represented, didn't put in a defense, didn't defend the case at all, and so the judgment defaults to the complainant, the Hobby Lobby. Dr. Obink was apparently last seen on a houseboat. Again, I suspect we're going to hear more about this one in future, but as things stand, the Hobby Lobby is owed over $7 million. As of yet, in the United Kingdom, where Dr. Obink is understood to be living, in spite of an investigation by Thames Valley Police, there have been no charges relating to the missing fragments that were illegally sold in the United States to the Museum of the Bible. This is not the case, however, in the case of the British Museum and its suspect former curator, Dr. Peter Higgs. Now, Dr. Higgs has been named in connection with the alleged theft and alleged damage to at least 1,800 items from the British Museum collection. Indeed, from a collection of jewels and jewellery fragments that Dr. Higgs was in charge of as a British Museum curator. There is an ongoing police investigation which limits what we at the Watching Brief can say about the events at the British Museum, but what we can do is report what's in the public domain and what's been reported in a civil trial which began where the British Museum is suing Dr. Higgs with regard to the alleged theft. The museum has told the court that they have evidence that Dr. Higgs was selling items from the collection over a period of at least 10 years to at least 45 buyers from around the world, and covered his tracks, quote, using false names, creating false documents and manipulating records. Now, that was information that came out of an initial hearing which took place at the end of March. In fact, it was on the 26th of March. The court at that hearing ordered Dr. Higgs to share any information he has on what was sold from the collection and the whereabouts of the items that are missing. So we wait to see what happens at the next hearing. One interesting snippet that came out of the hearing was that although many of the items weren't actually on the main British Museum catalogue, in 1993 there was an audit of the storeroom where this material was kept, which showed that there were 1,449 unregistered items. But in 2023, do the math, 30 years later, there was another audit, and then 1,161 artifacts were present. In other words, 20% of the items roughly were missing from the storeroom. And it points out, and the BBC point out, that Dr. Higgs worked for the Museum's Department of Greece and Rome from 1999 until the summer of 2023, and in fact was even promoted to be acting keeper of the Department of Greek and Roman in January 2021. A very, very senior position in the curatorial hierarchy at the British Museum. And speaking as we were of the British Museum has a new director. Dr. Nicholas Cullinan is moving a short distance up the road from Trafalgar Square and the National Portrait Gallery to Bloomsbury to head up the British Museum. The appointment of Dr. Cullinan to the permanent position of the director of the British Museum was announced by the Chair of Trustees, George Osborne, at the end of March. Dr. Cullinan is a former curator at the New York Met and at the Tate Modern. He's an art historian by background rather than an archaeologist. And I think the perhaps most important thing in terms of his CV into why he has the job at the British Museum is that he recently oversaw a complete refurbishment and reimagining of the National Portrait Gallery during the COVID period. He hasn't got any links to the British Museum regime either. And of course, that has recently been somewhat tainted by the allegations surrounding the theft of objects from its uncatalogued collection. It's a busy in tray, not least because, as well as the thefts, the British Museum is notoriously literally leaky and is looking at multi-million refurbishment, which it has to fundraise for. So a very, very big and a big appointment. That's the end of this Watching Brief special news report. If you've enjoyed the report or find what we do useful, interesting, please share it with your friends and colleagues, and we would really appreciate it if you would follow and support us on Patreon. You can support the Watching Brief and Archaeosoup on Patreon, and if you enjoy the work that we do on the pipeline and the investigative reporting, and I can tell you there are some major stories coming up in the next few months, but if you enjoy the work we do on the pipeline, please buy us a coffee from time to time. It would help keep us going, and we'd really appreciate it. Bye-bye.